Hi, fifth graders. We are going to start our next lesson on the New England colonies today. This lesson is called the Mayflower, Pilgrims, and Plymouth Colony, and it is about the New England colonies of Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. So what we're going to do first is we're going to do a little reading on these colonies that make up the New England colonies. And then we're going to hit the highlights of each colony and look at some positive and negative events in a timeline of these colonies. So I want you to go ahead and follow along with me as I read. This first part is about the Mayflower. The Mayflower was an English ship that set sail for the New World in 1620. The Mayflower left Plymouth, England, with 102 passengers and a crew of around 30. Many of those aboard the Mayflower were pilgrims seeking religious freedom. The colonists' goal was to land in northern Virginia and set up a British colony. Due to dangerous sailing conditions and delays during this time, the Mayflower was forced to change course and eventually anchor in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And then there was something called the Mayflower Compact. So many of you guys probably knew a little bit about the Mayflower just from learning about the first Thanksgiving and how our land was settled, especially maybe in fourth grade. But the Mayflower Compact is something that might be new to you. While anchored at Cape Cod, some colonists began to question their right to settle the area. So a group wrote and signed a governing document called the Mayflower Compact. It made it clear that the colony would be governed by just and equal laws, and those who signed it promised to obey the laws. So by just and equal laws, they meant that all the laws that people were made to follow of those who came on the Mayflower and settled would be fair and they would be equal for people. The document was built around the ideas of majority rule. The group with the most vote wins. Okay, so this, whenever they did vote on anything, it was just if there were 40 people voting and 21 people voted yes and 19 voted no, it would still go to the yeses because they were the most votes. That's what majority rule means. And the document was also built around the colonists' allegiance to the king. So these pilgrims that came over on the Mayflower were still in support of the King of England. The colonists hoped to create unity and order in the new colony. The Mayflower Compact was signed by 41 men, including gentlemen, adventurers, and tradesmen. No women signed the compact. So that's a little bit crazy because the colony is supposed to be governed by just and equal laws, but really they still were excluding women from any sort of decision making. However, tradesmen and adventurers weren't necessarily wealthy, so there were different classes of people who were able to make decisions and be part of voting. Then we've got the first Thanksgiving. After the devastating long winter, the 53 surviving pilgrims held a harvest festival. So if you remember, 102 pilgrims came over on the Mayflower, but only 53 of them, so a little over half of them, survived the winter. They were joined by Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoag tribe, and 90 of his men. The winter had been so deadly that only 4 of the original 18 female colonists were left alive. The 3-day-long celebration included a feast of turkey, fish, and corn. So think about that. There were only 4 females left out of 51 people total. Only 4 of them were female. So this is similar to what we were talking about in the southern colonies, that there were more men than women. The first winter, the colonists took several weeks to find a place to settle. They finally decided upon Plymouth Rock, a location chosen for its defensive position and because it had previously been a Native American settlement. The first winter was very difficult. The colonists had little time to build houses. In order to stay warm, they stayed on board the Mayflower. The limited space and bad conditions led to an outbreak of disease. When the colonists finally recovered from their illnesses, there were only 53 passengers still alive. When the worst of the weather had passed, the colonists constructed homes and a fort. They armed their fort with 6 iron gates. So these colonists, because they didn't plan enough ahead of time to build houses, they just didn't have time. They had to live on the ship, and if you remember, these ships were super crowded. And what we know about crowded conditions is diseases spread really, really easily and quickly in crowded conditions. Maybe it wasn't like a very hygienic place. People are all breathing the same air really close to each other. So these, and you know, people back then didn't know very much about viruses either. Like that wasn't something that that they had really studied as much about, and they had a very like rudimentary model of what a virus was. They didn't have all the understandings we have today. So they didn't even really understand that living in the ship in such close quarters would make them more vulnerable to getting sick. So that's how they all died, not from cold, not from starvation, but actually from illness. And then they decided, we're going to make this fort. Okay, and the last part of this reading is about William Bradford. He's in the bottom right corner of the page. William Bradford served as a leader of Plymouth Colony for many years. Born in Yorkshire, England, he traveled with the Pilgrims to the Netherlands and then to New England in search of religious freedom. When the Mayflower first arrived in the New World, William Bradford was among those who volunteered to explore the area. He was chosen to be governor in April of 1621 after Governor Carver collapsed while working in the fields. During his time as governor, Bradford made changes to the organization of the Plymouth Colony's government. For instance, he established a governor's council. The council consisted of a group of magistrates who were able to advise the governor and vote on government matters. So he made a council of all in the government, and that government council was made up of people called magistrates who could advise the governor and the council of what should be happening with the voting on whatever law or issue that they were voting on. William Bradford is also famous for his detailed history of Plymouth Colony, known as Of Plymouth Plantation. So this is a journal that he wrote. So, you know, like history was recorded mostly from letters and journals of the people of the time. So this is like a book that was a journal of William Bradford's called Of Plymouth Plantation. It gave us a lot of information about how people lived during this time. Bradford's journal detailed the colony's achievements and challenges. He was very religious and often drew parallels between everyday life and teachings in the Bible. So we're going to go over the difference between Puritans and Pilgrims. Puritans were very different from Pilgrims in a lot of ways, but they did have some similarities. We have just been talking about Pilgrims, and the Pilgrims were the ones who came over on the Mayflower. But soon you're going to start hearing about Puritans, so I wanted to show you the difference. So there are Puritan people here on the left side of the screen, and you can see that they have a very distinct style of clothing, very similar to the Pilgrims, but a little bit different. So the women tended to wear this big, what's called a waistcoat and a petticoat. And then underneath, that was like the thick dress. And then underneath they had a shift, which was kind of like an underdress. And then they had an apron over the top. And then they wore a little thing in their hair. It was kind of like a little bonnet or hat called a coif. And then the Pilgrim man usually had a big felt hat and a ruff around, or a ruffle type of thing around his neck, and then wore a doublet coat and cuffs on the sleeves of his coat. His pants were called breeches. They were kind of like short pants. And then garters were the things that held up his stockings, because like elastic wasn't a thing. So like they didn't have elastic socks. They just had, like stockings that they had to hold up with something else. And then of course they wore shoes. So the Puritans were, they arrived actually 10 years after the Pilgrims, and they believed that everybody should be part of the Church of England, or they should be punished. They supported the Church of England, but the reason they left England was because they didn't think that the Church of England in England was very pure anymore. They felt like too many Catholic beliefs were being let into the Church of England, and they were like, you know what, we want it how it used to be, so we're going to go to the New World, and we're going to start our Church of England in the New World, and it's going to be like the original Church of England, and we're not going to have all these Catholic beliefs come in. It's just going to be the Church of England. So they settled in Boston, and they were all loyal to the king. So even though they were making, they were going to try to find religious freedom because they wanted to practice Church of England in their way, they still were loyal to the king. Okay? And so then the Pilgrims, and you can see the Pilgrims in the picture above, and I'm going to disappear for a second so that I can show you this picture too. So the Pilgrims up here, you could see a lot of similarities in their dress. So the woman also had a bonnet. It was much bigger, and then she had a collar too around her neck, but she also had like a heavy dress and apron. The children also wore similar clothing. In the picture below, you can see that this Pilgrim woman had a similar type of outfit as well. And the man, the Pilgrim men, had the same kind of hat. It was a little bit different in shape. Instead of a ruff, they had the collar also. They also had a jacket, a heavy jacket, and they had the same kind of breeches with their stockings or socks pulled all the way up, and shoes. And they tended to wear a lot of buckles too, which is why you see that a lot. Okay, so I'm going to appear again. Hi. And the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock on the Mayflower, which we just went over. They did not want to belong to the Church of England. So they were not supporters of the Church of England. They wanted to come for religious freedom, and they were still loyal to the king, but they wanted to practice their own religion. Okay, so Pilgrims wanted their own religion. Puritans wanted a pure form of the Church of England. Okay, so now we're just going to go over the colonies. So the first one is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So this is where Plymouth was, and it was established in 1620. Later, it became part of Massachusetts Bay Colony. So at first, these were separate, and then they were combined into Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this was a Puritan society, and other religions were not tolerated here. So it was only Puritan. So they were Church of England in its purest form. Then there was the New Hampshire Colony. It was established in 1629, and it was governed by Massachusetts Bay until 1680, and then it became its own colony. It was mostly Puritan. So there were some people who were not practicing the Church of England there, but it was mostly Puritan. Then there was the Connecticut Colony. It was founded by Puritan leaders from Massachusetts Bay in 1639. So now in Massachusetts Bay, some people kind of started to spread out into the area that was Connecticut and started a new colony there. It was Puritan, just like Massachusetts Bay. Okay, so far we've got Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, totally Puritan, and then we've got the New Hampshire that is mostly Puritan. And then there's Rhode Island Colony. It was founded by Roger Williams in 1636, and it was a haven for religious dissenters. This meant that it was a place where people who were not going to follow the religion everybody else was, they went to Rhode Island. Okay, so there were people who didn't want to be Puritan, and some of them lived in New Hampshire, and it was fine. But some of them were just like, I'm not into this, and they went to Rhode Island. So they wanted religious freedom from that. And it's funny because the Pilgrims and the Puritans all came over for religious freedom, but what ended up happening is kind of like a dominant religion again in the New World, and then there were people who said, this is not my thing, and wanted to get away from it. So we're going to go through a timeline of positive and negative events. So I made the positive events are the up arrow, and the negative events are the down arrow. So the Plymouth Colony was chartered by King James I in 1606, and that was definitely a positive, thumbs up event, because all of a sudden you've got this group of people going over to the New World. In 1607, the Pilgrims flee England for the Netherlands, so they go to the Netherlands first in search of religious freedom. Again, a positive event. July 1620, the Pilgrims leave Netherlands to join up with the Mayflower. So again, positive event. In September 1620, the Mayflower set sail for the New World. Again, a positive event. Everything's going really well at this point. In 1620, the Mayflower is unable to reach Virginia due to dangerous conditions. So this is, this is not good, and so not where they were intending to go, and they couldn't get there. So there's their first negative event. But then they land and they create the Mayflower Compact. Positive. They figured it out, started their colony. And then they arrive in Plymouth, positive again. And in December through March of 1620 through 1621, many of the colonists die of illnesses due to harsh weather conditions. Boop. Definitely a negative event. Okay? And remember, they lost their population by almost half. Okay, March, April 1621, they meet the Wampanoag and sign a treaty. Really good. Okay, that is the most positive thing they could have done, because the Native Americans were there first. And then in 1621, Governor John Carver dies and is replaced by William Bradford. So this is kind of a negative thing and a positive thing. So a bummer that Governor John Carver died. That stinks. He was doing okay. But William Bradford did a lot for governing the colonies, so that was a positive thing. In October 1621, the Pilgrims celebrated their first Thanksgiving. So we learned a lot about Thanksgiving, about what it actually was versus what has been portrayed in a lot of history books, but it overall was a positive thing. Colonists experienced a food shortage That was a negative thing in 1621. So, you know, you think of November, and November is fall, it's getting close to winter. That's a real problem because there's less food that's going to be found in the winter than in the fall and summer and spring. And then in July through August of 1623, 2 ships arrived carrying about 100 new colonists. This is a positive, okay? So remember, this is like when the Puritans started coming over. And then in 1623, a fire destroys several buildings and homes. Definitely a negative. They didn't have like fire engines and firemen. Like, that wasn't a thing then. So if there was a fire, everybody in the colony, in the village, would have to kind of chip in and try to put it out, and it would be very difficult. So and think about how long it took to build things like that. So that was a major, major negative event. And then in June 1630, more colonists arrive, and the Plymouth colony continues. So they got through all of these positive and negative events, and their colony is starting to thrive. Okay, so now I want you to go on Schoology, and I've got a couple questions for you. When we study New England colonies, I think we have like 3 more lessons, and like one's the Salem witch trials, lots of interesting stuff about the New England colonies, especially about the politics of it. So we're going to do that, and then we will play Jeopardy again when we get done with the New England colonies before we move on to the middle colonies. So the questions that I want you to answer, the first one, what events on the timeline did you find most interesting and why? So you can go back and kind of look through the timeline. What did you find most interesting about that? And then what do you think was most challenging about reaching the New World on the Mayflower? So what do you think was probably the most challenging thing that somebody who was on the Mayflower would have to deal with while being on a ship like that? Okay, remember, it's not like a slave ship, because there weren't slaves coming over that way on the Mayflower. They were just those colonists, those 102 colonists that were coming over. Okay, so I will look forward to reading your responses on Schoology, and even if I don't get a chance to respond to every single one, please know that I am reading them and thinking about them when I do my next lesson. So I will see you guys soon. Thank you for watching.